Record. Recording in progress. Okay, welcome everyone. You just give me a moment. I'm gonna pin to the screen our esteemed panelists. Let's see if I can do that. That way, those are the people that you'll see. I'll spotlight you, Steven.
Oh my God, look at that background.
You guys are in for a treat.
Is he at the observatory?
You'll have to ask him.
Not tonight, I'm not, but
you wouldn't want to be out there.
Well, I can't be out there tonight. It's cloudy and disgusting, as opposed to just cold.
Yeah, very good. The waiting room is now disabled, which means anyone can get in. I'm just going to, so guys who are on our panel, I'm going to mute everyone right now, but then you will be able to manually unmute yourself afterwards. Okay, so here it goes. Okay, can you guys unmute yourselves? Just make sure. Okay, very good. Well, let's get a start to this program for tonight. So first of all, I want to thank our esteemed community members that are with us. Really, the impetus for starting this panel is that during my time here in Stanford, I have come by many remarkable different people that have very varied interests and talents. And after talking to people like Leah, Elliot, and then I met Stephen sometime later down the line, I thought it'd be really interesting during Tu B'Shvat, which basically in Judaism, it's the birthday of the trees, which everyone kind of ignores the halachic implications about Meiser Sheni and Orla that we'll save for a class another time. But it developed basically into the day of the year that Jews come together and talk about the natural environment. So I figured after meeting all these cool people that have different interests in the natural world that we'll get to hear from them soon, why not do it on Tu B'Shvat? So I know, Leah, I told you this like 8 months ago, and I already booked you in advance, and Elliot as well. So I'm so glad that the three of you can join us. Now, I mean, Leah, you don't need an introduction because it looks like half the people here are your family. Hello to all the I see a lot of Gordons and Winters on the screen here tonight. And many new people I don't recognize as well. So welcome, everybody. So here's the plan for this evening. I will briefly just let you know who these three individuals are, who you might not know yet. Afterwards, each of our esteemed panelists who are with us will have about 5 minutes to just introduce themselves in more depth, talk about the work that they're doing vis-a-vis the natural world and the environment, following which I have a number of prepared questions just to learn more from their general knowledge. And then perhaps in about the last 15 or so minutes of the program, ending hopefully at 8:30, we'll open up the floor for questions if you guys have more to inquire about. So here we go in no particular order other than that which is written on my paper. I guess ladies first. First, we have Dr. Leah Winter, who is with us, who is a postdoctoral fellow and incoming assistant professor of chemical and environmental engineering at Yale University. I presume that's what's in your background there. Is that Yale?
It is. It's right next to the building where I work. Okay,
fantastic. So, everyone here, by the way, has like a really fancy virtual background. I feel so technologically deficient with just a curtain from my window here. But this is why you guys are the panelists and I'm just the moderator. Next, we have Dr. Stephen Labkoff, who's the global head of clinical and healthcare informatics at, you'll tell me if I pronounce this right, Quantori.
Quantori, that's right.
Quantori, I was close there.
You were close.
I was close. And then we have Mr. Elliot Glassman, who is the senior associate and senior technical principal at WSP Built Ecology, as well as all those other letters that are there on your Zoom screen that maybe you'll be able to tell us about. So we'll go in order of we'll go in reverse order. How about let's change things up. Elliot, why don't you start us off, and then Stephen, and then Leah. So let's hear a little bit about the work that you do and what that virtual background has to do with your presentation.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Elliot Glassman. Thank you to Rabbi Kurtz for organizing this event, as well as everybody else at CAS and my co-panelists. I'm an architect by profession. I'm also a high-performance building consultant. And what that means is that I help clients, developers, and fellow architects design buildings that are highly energy efficient. In fact, a lot of our work goes beyond things you might have heard of like LEED, and we try to design net zero energy buildings. But we also are concerned with other things related to environmental performance in the built environment, such as reduction of water consumption, having better indoor air quality, and things like visual and thermal comfort in buildings. So my experience is quite varied. I've worked on projects ranging from commercial buildings to institutional, to multifamily residential, hospitality, healthcare, sports stadiums and museums. And the common theme between all of them is environmental sustainability. And the projects have been located on at least 4 continents in a variety of different climates, each requiring a different response to how they're being used and the climate that they're based in order to reduce environmental impact. So in addition to being an architect, I use computer modeling of energy and daylight performance and computational fluid dynamics to study how the building is going to perform and aid in the design process. And my particular specialty is in using computers, automation to quickly evaluate design alternatives and help optimize the building for performance. And as far as the alphabet soup that's after my name, some of those relate to my architectural license. Some of them are related to different building certification systems. I always explain it as like kind of like a mashgiach for green buildings. So there's the LEED system, and then there's a passive house, which is another system that I'm accredited in.
Very, very good, Elliot. You know, I'm glad you brought up the idea of being a mashgiach, because God willing, one of the questions I'll ask you later in the session to address is if and how do you see your work relating to Judaism and to God? So I'm sure your mashgiach work there might have something to inform us about the Jewish aspect of what you do. Let's move on to Stephen. I am especially fascinated by your background. I know that you are coming at this session from a professional and from I guess we'll call a hobby standpoint. So maybe you want to let us know what you do professionally, what you do in terms of your hobby, which I think relates to what you deliberately put in the background of your screen.
Yeah, thank you. Here's some echoes. Thank you, Rabbi Kurtz. So my name is Steve Lapkov. I'm a physician by training. Though I studied cardiology and was a cardiologist for a while, I changed careers almost 25 years ago and went into the field of medical informatics, which is the use of medical data for various functions in the healthcare ecosystem. For the last several years, I was working at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, working on cancer research using big data from basically from patients' donated information, from their blood, from genomic analysis, from immunological analysis, in order to try and find a cure for myeloma, which is a devastating blood cancer that is in some ways related to leukemia. My reason for the background, though, is that I am a very avid photographer. And one of the things that I do as a hobby, almost as an obsession, is I do astrophotography locally at the Westport Astronomical Association, Westport Astronomical Society. And I'm one of about half a dozen astrophotographers that are there. And when you guys are generally in bed, toasty warm in your homes, I'm oftentimes on a clear night outdoors, either on a field at the observatory or in the observatory dome, making photographs of deep space objects like the ones I'll share maybe later in this call. The reason why I think it relates to this conversation is Rabbi Cohen is constantly telling me that all over the Torah, it talks about looking up at the sky and feeling sort of at one with the universe. And maybe Rabbi Kurtz can give me the better connection point there with whatever parshas it relates to. But Rabbi Cohen has actually had members of the shul come to the observatory. We've had a special night for members to come up and take a look through the telescope and see some of these objects, which I'll share later. And with regards to Tu B'Shvat, in terms of what makes it important is that the ability to even see these objects is predicated on having clear skies, and having clear skies when you live 35 miles from New York is a bit. In the month of February, and I'll let Rabbi Cohen know when that's going to open. And we're going to be displaying large art pieces for, and we'll have them for sale. The proceeds are going to help us raise money for the observatory so we can buy more gear. Because, you know, when you're in a hobby like this, you can never have enough gear to do things like what you see behind me. And I'll pause for now and hand it back.
All right, definitely. And I already see in the chat that Sam Soroka mentioned the James Webb Space Telescope. So I'm going to ask you about that soon, but I want to get to our final esteemed panelist, Leah Winter, to hear about the work and research that you're doing at Yale, and then we'll circle back to some of the topics that we already alluded to.
Thanks, Rabbi Kurtz, for organizing the panel, and it's super exciting to also be able to learn from these esteemed other co-panelists. So as Rabbi Kurtz said, I'm a researcher at Yale in chemical and environmental engineering. I'm currently a postdoc, and I'll be starting as faculty also at Yale this summer. So in my research, I focus on how we can maintain food, energy, and water resources, while also minimizing impacts to the global climate and the environment based on how we obtain these food, energy, and water resources. And in particular, there are a lot of trade-offs between how we get food, energy, and water. And we also end up being pretty limited in having equal access for global populations to these different resources. So what do I mean by these trade-offs between food, energy, and water? So for example, to get clean water, let's say from the oceans or from reservoirs, we need to purify it, which takes a lot of energy to get that purification process. When we make fertilizer for food, the fertilizer production process consumes 2% of global energy output each year. When we try to make vehicles more sustainable, so if we move towards electric vehicles with batteries as a green alternative to gasoline-powered cars, we need to have a lot more batteries. But battery manufacturing produces large amounts of wastewater with a lot of contaminants that end up needing to be treated or getting disposed of to the environment. Or if we want the alternative, instead of electric vehicles, to be biofuels so that we can get corn ethanol as an alternative to gasoline for our cars. But when we're growing crops for fuels, that ends up potentially competing with land for agriculture for food. So then we're using the same land for fuels that we might need to make food. So in my research, I try to think about how we can have the energy and material resources that go into these processes that can be more sustainable and help us avoid some of these trade-offs. So my approach in my research of how do we make these processes more sustainable and how do we make the energy and the resources going into them be renewable is to electrify these processes and to circularize them for making food, energy, and clean water. So to electrify chemical processes means that we can make them compatible with renewable electricity, since renewable energy, when we get it from solar panels or from wind turbines, ends up in the form of electricity. So this way we can provide energy for these processes directly with renewable electricity as opposed to burning fossil fuels. So this would look something like being able to plug your car directly into a solar panel and pour in some water and have your car make its own fuel from the sun, water, and air. Or you can maybe have a water cleaning system that you dump sewage into and it spits out clean water and fertilizer that you can use directly for farming. The kinds of technologies that I use for this, and don't worry if these don't make a lot of sense to you, but I use electrochemistry, which is kind of like batteries, but in water, and something called plasma, which is basically lightning in a box. So basically electrified processes that can do these kinds of chemical processes and chemical reactions. And the other advantage of these electrified processes is that they can be done on a much smaller scale, which means that they're easier to deploy in developing or non-industrialized communities. So that's the electrifying piece. The other goal of my research is to circularize these processes so that we can try to eliminate waste from them. And this is more of a trash to treasures economy, where we can use renewable material resources as the inputs for these processes. So for example, we can take contaminants in wastewater or sewage and turn them into fertilizers to make for farming or valuable chemicals. Or we can take CO2, which from the atmosphere, where CO2 is a major cause of climate change, and we can turn that CO2 into renewable fuels. So we can then replace fossil fuels with fuels made from CO2 while also reducing the climate change impacts of it. So Rabbi Kurtz, I know you mentioned you wanted us to make a connection to how does our work relate to Torah and God. So briefly, my research focuses on how we can ensure energy, food, and water security while also minimizing environmental impacts such as climate change or pollution. So for me, this research is all kind of motivated by Torah values that have been instilled in me from when I was little. Right, the quote that you included in the advertisement for this, that God created the earth and we are charged to work and guard it, from Bereshit chapter 2. So what drew me to environmental engineering was the ability to try to work on ways to maintain the environment, an environment that allows us to be healthy and safe, since without clean water, without access to energy, without sufficient nutrients, we become sick. And Judaism holds protecting life and saving even one person as one of its highest values. And of course, the other piece of it, what my work actually looks like, is not as much on these grand scales, but working on fundamental research. And this is part of what I find most exciting each time that I discover something new, a way that our world works that no one knew of before. To me, it feels like a new portion of God's creations have been revealed to me. So for example, when I was in grad school, one thing I was working on is trying to make a chemical reaction occur that had never been achieved before. And when I was working in the lab and started to see the data that showed that the reaction had actually happened, it wasn't just an idea that I have thought of, but it actually existed in the world. It felt like Hashem had revealed some secret of his universe to me. So of course, most of the time these things don't work, which makes it even more of a miraculous feeling when it does work.
Very good. Thanks so much for that, Leah. And I like how you transitioned into the Jewish piece of this. I just want to now ask, I was going to go in a different order, but this is a very good segue. So thank you. To ask Elliot and then Stephen, if and how you see God and specifically Judaism in the work that you do, and in what ways, if at all, you may even find challenges between the two, if that exists. So Elliot, do you want to go first? And then Stephen, after you go, I want to ask you a few questions about a little bit about your cosmological spread that you got in the back of your screen there.
Yeah, so I definitely see a lot of connections. I don't know that I actually even see any contradictions. I see that the built environment has a tremendous impact on people. We spend 90% of our lives in buildings, according to the United States Green Building Council, maybe a little bit more during the pandemic. And so it has an influence on us. And I think there's very much, you're influenced by your environment. So there's definitely a dimension there, spiritually, physically, that there's an influence, and therefore the built environment has great capacity to do good or to do harm, to be equitable, or to create disparities between people. And has big impact on human health and well-being. I could, and I have lectured forever on the impacts of daylight in buildings on our health and psychological sense of well-being, on thermal comfort, on indoor air quality, and then also on the natural world. Buildings consume 70% of our electricity. They're responsible for 40% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And so they have a tremendous role to play in the quality of the natural environment. And so, and we could get into other ways that they impact the environmental aspects and the ecology later on. I could give more details, but to focus on the Jewish aspect of it, I always think about the story of the old man and the carob tree. And he, plants a carob tree, even though he's not going to see the benefits of it. He wants to preserve it for the next generation. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try to preserve the environment for our children and our children's children. And therefore, I definitely see, like, one of my primary motivations is driven by this desire to, preserve the natural environment, to promote environmental and social justice in the built environment. And therefore, and I think Judaism is really a driver of that. And I think there are other aspects, probably too much to go into, but things related to appreciation for Hashem's creation in terms of daylight, in terms of flora and fauna, and how the built environment could enhance the appreciation for those things, preserve them, and call our attention to them. So, and then enhance our connection with them. And so that's a primary driver in the work that I do, even if it's not something I share with my colleagues on a day-to-day basis. It's really, I think, part of what I was meant to do, and the way in which I connect to Judaism in a profound way.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like you're bringing those values into the work that you do, similar to how Leah described. I know also, maybe we'll say this for later, you pointed out to me that I think it was in your thesis that some of the architecture that you've witnessed or made yourself was inspired by things from Judaism, from the religion. So maybe we'll hear about that soon. We'll shift over to Stephen, who seems to have gone to the next galaxy. Oh, okay. So Stephen, I think, one of the things that relates a lot, I mean, you mentioned about the stars and the biblical connection. It's always just fascinating that when you think of stars, you see them in the Bible. We talk about how the Jewish people, Abraham's children, will become as numerous as the stars in the sky. But ancient societies really just look at stars and you see these shiny speckles in the sky. Maybe they even attribute divinity to them. The idolatrous nations worship the celestial beings. But, when you learn the science behind it, you realize there are these major fusion chambers, that it's gravity, and it's like all these different crazy things that are happening, fusing different kinds of elements and whatnot together. So maybe you could let us know about your work or your hobby in terms of what you're doing with the not astrology, astronomy. That's always a mistake rabbis make. It's not astrology, it's astronomy. Astrology is what we read about in the Parshios recently that the Egyptians did. So let us know a little bit more about your work. I know you have a few pictures you might want to show us, and how you see Judaism and God and what you do.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me about my hobby is that in some respects, it's kind of an extension of my day work, because it has to do a lot with understanding. You're looking for, in my day work, when I'm working on cancer research using data, it's really trying to find the minutest little bits of information that might relate to finding an answer to some question. And that's really becomes what's known as a signal to noise issue. And signal to noise is understanding how to pull signal out of a noisy background is precisely what I do for my day job. And it's also what I do for my hobby, which is, until recently, I didn't quite put two and two together, but it really is exactly the same type of work, but less social. The work I do with the astrophotography is really pointing cameras through telescopes at objects in the sky. And they're very, very dim. The one that's behind me, and I'll just shut the camera so you can see it, that's known as the Orion Nebula. And that nebula is actually visible to the human eye. And you don't even need a telescope or binoculars to see it. It's just below Orion's belt, the 3 stars in Orion's belt. And you can see it as a little pinkish blur to the naked eye. And if you put on a pair of binoculars or even a telescope, you can start to see some of the details that are there. And what I find fascinating is that everything that I can share with you tonight are things that you can see if you only know how to look for them. And they're always there, they're always in the sky. And all you really need to do to see them is to just look up. My day work doesn't really relate to Tikkun Olam as much as the other 2 panelists do. I'm not in the business of trying to, save the environment for the sake of the environment. I am trying to save people's lives, which then they can then help save the environment. So I don't know if that's a derivative type of work there, and there's a connection. But to the astrophotography, to me, it's really about, growing up as a child, I never really had a understanding of what God was all about. And looking up into the sky and seeing all these objects that are literally sometimes up to millions of light years away, it makes me wonder about the extent of God's impact, the extent of God's manifestations. Did he just decide to focus in on the earth? Well, I look up every time I go to the observatory and I think, what a waste. If he only decided to work on the earth, it's kind of like what Carl Sagan says in his book Contact. It's an awful waste of time and space if all they ever did was focus in on just our one little itty bitty planet. There are billions and billions of galaxies, let alone planets. We can, almost can't even begin to believe that we're the only ones out there. And if Hashem is a God that has such reach and such impact, you got to think there's got to be more than us out there, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Right, of course. And we could definitely go down the line and talk about Fermi's paradox and why haven't we seen other intelligent life. Might take us a little far afield, but I think along the lines of what you're saying, I want to circle back to a comment that Sam Soroka brought up, and then we'll go back to, obviously, Leah, Elliot, if you have something to weigh in on this, please do. But then I'll ask you guys a little bit more about the saving the environment stuff, which I know you guys specialize in. The James Webb Space Telescope, after 20 plus, 30 plus years in development, finally was launched, and it seems for the most part, it's on trajectory for success. Can you tell us why this is a monumental achievement and what it's going to show humanity about, God's creation of the universe that we would not have been able to see otherwise?
Sure. So 30 years ago, Hubble went up. And Hubble has, showed us things in the universe, largely in the visual spectrum, but in some of the other electromagnetic spectrum as well. James Webb is larger and has a much greater reach. And I believe it's going to be able to reach something like 100 times deeper into the cosmos than Hubble can. And with much greater resolution, the mirror system on it is much larger than Hubble's. It's going to be reading light in the infrared spectrum, which is longer wavelengths. We can't see that with the human eye, but the sensors on the cameras actually can. And it's going to hopefully unwind mysteries around things like black holes. It'll unwind mysteries about exoplanets. It'll unwind mysteries, what else is out there. I don't know if you all know this, but there was a spot in space. I don't remember precisely where it was, but for 100 years or more scientists really thought, they point a telescope up and they see absolutely nothing. And something about 10 or 15 years ago, they decided we're going to just point Hubble at that one patch of space and let it record light. And they let it record light for a little over a month. And when they came back and looked at the data, they didn't just see, black space. They saw hundreds and hundreds of galaxies. And James Webb is going to be able to show us, even more than that. I mean, they possibly even back to the Big Bang. Light, when you look at the stars and you see some of these objects that are light years away, if I switch my background and show you the Andromeda galaxy, one of the things that I can tell you is that you're actually looking at a time machine of sorts, because, let me put it up here a moment. This is the Andromeda galaxy. The light that came from this galaxy left that area 2.3 million years ago, and it's been traveling at the speed of light for 2.3 million years. So what looks like that spiral galaxy there, that light's been traveling, an awfully long time, from an awfully long distance. And I don't even know how to convert light years into actual distance off the top of my head. I can do it with my computer, but it's really, really far. And it's, again, I find it fascinating. Now, the bit about the environment is the more we have air pollution and the more we put up satellites that obscure the sky, and, if Starlink is up there, it's a balancing act, because the things satellites let us do are super, super important. We couldn't be doing Zoom tonight, probably because of, if we didn't have satellites bouncing signals from here to there. But at the same time, it makes it harder to look up and see some of these things when more and more of these objects are going to be obscured by little strands of light passing through your photographs or through your research. So, yeah. But we do need both.
You do. All right. Well, this is fascinating. And, I think at some point you'll give us a tour of all your photos, not during this session, I think, because we're limited on time, but I think it can't be understated. The human mind cannot fully comprehend the scope of the galaxy. Even I think the closest star system, what's it, Proxima Centauri, 4 light years away or so. So you're traveling at the speed of light for 4 years, you'll get there. Can humans ever get there? I have no idea. Okay, so I want to shift a little bit to something that I think Leah and Elliot, you might specialize in more, but Stephen, I think you might have some commentary too. I want to talk about I'm trying to think of what's the most apolitical way to say it. The climate crisis. I mean, that's I don't know. Okay, our goal, by the way, is to stay as apolitical as possible. Naturally, if you think having any opinion on how the environment in the world, how our world environment is being affected by technology and corporations today, is political, then I guess naturally it's inherently politicized. But we're going to try not to politicize things. And really, the reason we have people like you who have such high credentials is to really share with us real information rather than CNN or Fox op-eds. So, but before I ask you guys to share just your take and your understanding of what is going on right now in this world and how your work is helping us with that, I just wanted to share a little bit of a Torah perspective that I think relates to the environment, which is one of the go-to sources in the Torah about saving the environment is the injunction of Bal Tashchis, of not needlessly destroying things. So the prototypical example is a fruit tree, but really Chazal, the rabbis, understood that what Hashem meant is don't needlessly destroy anything. And the Sefer HaChinuch that I have with me, which is a collection of the 613 commandments were given in the Torah, he explains what's the reason for Bal Tashchis. Why can't we needlessly destroy things? He says, "V'zehu derech hachasidim ba'anshe ma'isa," those who are exceedingly pious and righteous in their disposition. Ohavim shalom usmeichim b'tuva brios u'makarven osala Torah. They don't get rid of anything. They care for the smallest little possession or the smallest little thing in this world. Like our forefather Jacob, Yaakov, he went back just to get pachin kitanim, just to get little jars. And that's when he got into an altercation with the angel of Esau, I guess in English. And that's the nature of righteous people, that they care even for the smallest little things, and they want to preserve things rather than destroy things. Whereas he says, whereas the wicked, they rejoice when things get destroyed. They love destroying things. Now, that might be true on both extremes, but I think that's really a complicated notion for us to swallow in what we're seeing develop today. I doubt that most people who get accused of doing things that are not environmentally friendly or destroying the environment have like this inherently evil inclination, like, like, well, how am I going to, pollute the world and destroy it today? But people aren't necessarily trying to be bad, and people aren't necessarily thinking about being good when they do things. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, A, what is the challenge that we are, if we are facing today in terms of the environment? And B, what are the solutions that you're offering, as well as you think others could be taking upon themselves in order to help our world? Elliot, it looks like you've been commenting in the chat. Why don't you just share it with us directly, and then Leah.
Sorry, yeah, I was just when you said no one is actively saying they're going to ruin the planet, I said unless they're a villain on Captain Planet. So that was just my peanut gallery. But yes, I think we all play a role, whether we realize it or not. We own our homes that consume energy. The homes sit on land that has been disturbed and changes the hydrology, so that might contribute to floods. It might prevent an aquifer from being recharged. It displaces habitat for flora and fauna. So I think we could be, intentional when we are looking to upgrade our homes. That, Connecticut has very good incentive programs for improving the energy and even water performance of homes. I think they give you aerators, and there's just so many resources out there, so much more than there used to be, as well as folks that have the knowledge now to whether it be our businesses or homes, to improve the environmental performance of the built environment, and just to be very conscious and intentional about it. What materials are we putting in? My wife and I just purchased a home, and we're in the midst of repainting, and made sure to get low VOC paint, which has less chemicals in it, and will not off gas as much. That's good for our health, but it's also better for the environment. So I think it's just becoming educated about the options that are out there. There's sometimes stigma related to environmental things, like, oh, it's going to be costly, or it's not going to work as well. And I don't think that those things are necessarily true. Part of what I do is looking at very integrated ways and very strategic ways of integrating sustainability from the get-go. So it's not an add-on that costs more later, but it's embedded in whatever you are doing. And I think there are definitely products that have come a long way. There's a site that I use all the time to look up low flush toilets, which actually flush more solid, can handle more capacity than even some of the higher use toilets. Whereas I think a lot of people were turned off initially for low flush toilets because the first generation didn't work as well. But it's getting better all the time. The technology is getting better all the time. And like Leah, we're looking into things like electrification, because our electricity grid is getting cleaner as more renewables are being used to generate the energy that's being used in homes. And we're trying to move buildings off of natural gas and to use electricity. And even though, again, there's this stigma of electricity being more expensive, we have new technology like high efficiency heat pumps that can do the same thing more efficiently, more cost effectively, even in colder climates. So these are all things that I think, it's clearly the technology is not there. I think it's just a knowledge gap of how to what the possibilities are and how to integrate them. So I think those are the things that we could be more conscious of, and thinking about it holistically, and thinking about the waste that's being generated by either construction activities or the activities within the building, the food waste. How can we start to reduce those things or make use of the land that we might have to compost, so and create a place for that, so it's not onerous or burdensome to do, but something that's quite convenient.
Very good. So Elliot, it sounds like, the angle you're giving us is there are many things that we can easily do to change our lives, or not by changing our lives in any major way, that can really contribute to environmental protection. Leah, I know that in your profession, you're working on the chemical level, I guess we can say. So if you could speak to A, what are the problems or the challenges that you're seeing, and B, how are you / how do you think we as a community and as humanity should be addressing any challenges that you've identified?
Yeah, sure. And I'll talk a little bit more on the global scale as we think about these processes, as you're saying, right? So we think about, why do we find ourselves in these climate crises or environmental crises? So I like to think, at least, that it's mostly not because people are wicked, right? Maybe it's the villains on Captain Planet, as Elliot was saying. But most of these issues came about because people were trying to make progress and make our lives better. So for example, if we think about fertilizer production, when fertilizer production first, on a large scale, first started with the Haber-Bosch process in the 1920s, 1930s, after that time, global populations started to spike. And if you look at the amount of fertilizer that we make and the global population, those curves track with each other. So making fertilizer on an industrial scale is this huge kind of progress for humanity. We can ensure food security. But at the same time, making fertilizer emits 2% of all of the world's CO2 every year. So now we have a climate crisis, partially because of all the CO2. Or if we think about water pollution, for example, making something like DDT, right? We come up with all these great chemicals that can protect us from mosquito bites, that can protect our crops from other kinds of vermin, that we can make pharmaceuticals. But a lot of these plants end up disposing of these wastes out into the environment, and then we have things like Cancer Alley and Love Canal, where people end up getting sick from this contamination. So I think we're now at a point that we've made a lot of this progress, but we need to reimagine how we make these resources. How do we ensure that we have energy when and where we need it? How do we make sure we have enough food and clean water? So this gets into, and also, how do we address climate change as we're doing all of this? So thinking about climate change and what do we do about this, a lot of the efforts right now are in mitigation and adaptation. So to mitigate climate change, we need to think about, how do we reduce the CO2 emissions? How do we basically stop climate change from continuing to happen? So this is where we hear these numbers, like from the Paris Climate Accords, limiting to 2 degrees C. Now we're limiting to 1.5 degrees C of warming for the planet, based on different types of and some of my work that aims toward this mitigation piece is trying to electrify the processes for getting fuel, food, clean water, so that they can run on renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels, and also in trying to circularize these processes so that we can use CO2 or use waste as materials inputs to making these different resources, as opposed to fossil fuels, which are the conventional ways of putting energy and even materials into these processes. So in addition to mitigation, we also have the adaptation piece. Climate change is happening. We see it in fires, we see it in droughts, and we're not going to be able to stop it. We're just trying to limit it. But as it's happening, we need to come up with ways to adapt to it. So this is some of my works on trying to make some of these technologies on a small scale, so that we can, for example, have energy collection and storage on a small scale, or water treatment on a small scale. And this can allow us to have a more distributed grid, which can withstand more failures or bolster resilience during natural disasters. So for example, we think about the Houston freeze or increasing hurricanes in Connecticut. My parents recently got a generator for the house that they've used, I think, like 5 times so far living in Connecticut. So having more of a distributed system for making clean water and and capturing energy at the household level or at a neighborhood level can help us become more resilient as we experience more extreme climate events that we can no longer necessarily rely on a conventional grid.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a good distinction that you made, Leah, which is between the climate issues we're experiencing and perhaps just general environmental sensitivities. I mean, let me ask. I'm just asking as the balabus here, the ignorant consumer individual. I came from New York, where at the time I left, there were 4 different kinds of garbages to put things into, and God knows there might be exponentially more garbage pails for all sorts of different paraphernalia to put every single category of waste into. How is this kind? I'm just saying, like, the kind of things that the average person like me is seeing as just an individual, a consumer. How are these practices really moving the needle? And I think maybe this might be more of an ethical question than a practical question. One of the claims that I've heard made by many people is that it's one thing if a government legislates something on a major level, but for individuals to become more climate conscious, and when you think about it, if I'm not mistaken, China's the most major producer of CO2 emissions in the world. I don't remember the percentage, but they account for a very disproportionate amount of it. So I'm just asking, like, myself, just a regular American family living here in Stamford, Connecticut, are the actions that I'm taking, are they actually going to help the environmental crises that you are all identifying? Or this might sound cynical, but I'm just conveying what others have said to me as well. It's almost like a form, some would say, of virtue signaling. So, okay, I guess, Elliot, looks like you want to jump in on that one.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's a Jewish connection there too. I think from, I guess, the way I kind of view our responsibility as Jews, our communal responsibility is we're all acting as individuals as part of a larger collective. And our individual actions have repercussions, and we're supposed to be the best people we can be kind. And I think in the same way, our individual actions and consumption or helping the environment can collectively add up. Maybe it only makes a small difference. Maybe it's a local difference. But they always say, think globally, act locally. And I think that all of us acting in concert can make a difference, helping each other, sharing the knowledge of what we've learned about best practices, different technologies that are coming out, and improving our individual behavior. I think that could translate into something bigger. Now, what I've noticed in the years that I've been in the profession, probably a little bit more than I like to admit, is this transformation. I remember talking to a developer when I first started and being very interested in this issue of sustainability, and having him tell me the only green he cared about was the green in his wallet. And being very concerned about his individual profit on a project and not wanting to invest not necessarily the money in green technologies, but the time that it took to learn how to do things better. And now, to act this I guess, balance between individual action and collective or governmental action, I think our response was to him, at some point, this is going to be the law of the land. You're going to have to do it. You might as well learn how to do it now, when if you fall short, there's no consequence to it. But now we're seeing cities and states and even the federal government taking action. New York City, starting in 2024, will start fining buildings for having too much carbon emissions. So we're seeing a lot of this stuff become legislation, and sort of everyone's struggling to catch up with how do we meet these new environmental criteria for our buildings. And certain places have banned new natural gas hookups, and have started to try to do a series of carrots and sticks, improve the performance of buildings, whereas before it was more voluntary, and kind of the people that were doing it because, you know, maybe there was an element of virtue signaling or wanting to portray their brand or their company as being environmentally sensitive. But I think some of it were just people that felt passionate about doing the right thing. And now it's more and more that you have to do it, or some aspect of it. And how could we go further? Because what's being mandated and required still is not going to get us where we need to be to avert the worst impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Elliot. So just clarification, again, coming from this as a layman here.
Yeah.
I understand the reduction of CO2 emissions, the ozone layer, and climate change. But I find that, and maybe I'm wrong, that a lot of environmental things kind of get conflated into the same category. Is me recycling my plastic into the right bin have to do with reducing CO2 and saving the environment, or is this a completely separate initiative and we kind of just put them all into the same classification when we talk about the environment? This is anyone can answer this one.
Oh,
Might be a better question for Ray.
For what?
For Leah.
Oh, okay. Leah,
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my answer to that is that they really are all interconnected. So the more that we can reduce waste and reuse things, the less energy we have to put in to make something completely new. So if you think about even if you're going into your fridge and you don't have a lot of food in there, but you have some leftovers and you can kind of put those together to make a meal, then you don't have to spend more money versus if you're going to order food in, you're going to the grocery store and you have to take all this energy to go out there and buy it. Or if you're like me, just order your groceries online and spend money. So in the same way, if you're recycling plastics, then they can turn that into something else, and you don't have to start from the very beginning where you're extracting fossil fuels from the ground. That's buried carbon that was otherwise in the ground. If we need to make new plastics, we're taking it out of the ground. We're doing a chemical process and putting all this energy in to turn that into new plastics. Of course, there are a lot of issues with how plastic recycling works nowadays, and there's a lot of research into making greener plastics that can be recycled.
So I'd like to just, I've been sort of listening to all this, and I actually do in fact believe that humans have a tremendous impact on our environment, but I'm a little more circumspect about some of these initiatives, because I think somebody mentioned, whether it was you or Elliot earlier, the amount of energy it takes to create a battery for a Tesla, that's not necessarily carbon neutral, and nor is it helping the earth necessarily by stripping, strip mining to get to neodymium. And, I find that I'm a little older than the two of you, and I've been around for a little longer. And what I'm trying to understand is the balance of the political rhetoric around all this and what appears to be making sense. But if you take it on average and you look at it holistically across the entirety of the entire process, beginning to end, it's unclear to me that, a Tesla is actually necessarily doing good for the world. I haven't done the calculations in terms of the amount of energy it takes to build a battery, how much strip mining it takes to mine the neodymium to get neodymium magnets. But it looks as if it's a good idea, but at the other end of the equation, the electricity to power the Tesla's got to come from a power plant somewhere. And the power plant's going to be fueled by what? Coal, oil, natural gas. I don't know too many solar plants, except for maybe in California, that are able to generate enough power to generate what's needed here. So what I keep coming back to and wondering is, there's a balancing act here. Of course, it makes sense to do things in a way that is responsible, to recycle. It makes sense to have clean buildings. But I wonder how much of the political rhetoric that goes along with this is just that. It's taking what is a good idea and politicizing it and not just leaving it as a good idea. Because on average, I'm not completely convinced, and maybe you guys know better since you're much deeper into it, what does it take to build a Tesla or an electric car? And how much energy will it actually save on average? And what do those calculations really, truly look like? Does it actually stack up?
So that's definitely some of the things that we look into, because for us the questions are, how do you reduce the need for some of these things in the first place? Our goal is not to put all the solar panels that you would need on a building. That's usually the last step. First thing we want to do is design the building so it needs less energy to begin with. Now, and one of the things that I've loved about the conversation is seeing some of the learning what you guys are doing and seeing some of the parallels with my work, because when Leah was talking about the energy used to make certain things, one of the conversations that's coming up now, because our buildings are getting more energy efficient, is that a bigger part of the environmental impact of the building is the what we call the embodied energy, which is the energy used to make the materials of it. And one of those things that could be potentially material intensive in terms of the energy is the insulation in the building. So we have sophisticated computer modeling that we use to weigh the impacts of how much energy we're going to save in the operation of the building by having that insulation versus the embodied energy that we're using to manufacture and put that embodied energy, that insulation in the building. So I think we could find the right balance, and we want to get to the point where we're just being smart about how we're designing the building, not putting the windows in the place where we're going to get a lot of solar heat gain and going to need a lot of conditioning. Just try to make it as passively comfortable as possible, and then use more efficient mechanical systems. And something else that Leah alluded to in terms of sometimes this nexus between energy and water. Some of the mechanical systems we have that are more energy efficient consume more water, and so sometimes we'll use less efficient energy systems in countries where there's water stress, so that we could conserve on water. So it's about finding the right strategies, not a one size fits all. And in short, what I'm saying is it has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis and try to reduce the need for things like solar panels or whatever goes into it. And just two more thoughts and I'll wrap up. A series of thoughts is that, the most environmental car is not a Tesla. It is not having the need for a car at all. So it's thinking about the ways that we design our cities to make them more walkable, to have better public transportation, so we could avoid, having the need for as many cars and all the materials and the batteries that are embodied thereof. So I think again, it's more about trying to be avoiding these things, and not in a way that deprives us. I think there's better quality of life, getting that exercise and having a walkable, vibrant neighborhood. And I think also like getting natural gas out of buildings leads to better indoor air quality in buildings. So it's really about finding those connections. And I think the last thought I had was, again, another Jewish connection. I think, I'm not sure where, but it says like one of the things that came with creation was a hammer, because we didn't have any tools. So we needed a hammer to make all subsequent tools. Rabbi Kurtz can correct me because this is his area of expertise, but I think of it the same way in terms of, yes, we needed probably fossil fuels to run the factory that was making the solar panels, but eventually, solar panels will be powering the manufacture and extraction of future solar panels. So I think hopefully as the grid decarbonizes, and that's an area where we've gotten involved and use NREL's projections of how the grid is decarbonizing through distributed solar, not just utility scale solar, and renewables like wind. But we are getting to the point where a lot of these things do make sense holistically, because the grid is getting cleaner.
Very good. We're actually at 8:32, so we should actually wrap this up.
Okay.
Okay, we'll have if any concluding thoughts that you guys wanted to share on anything that we addressed or did not address. I see that there's a question in the chat. Does the efficiency of building include its full life cycle from concrete manufacture, end of life destruction? Okay, that's from Mary Sherman. I'll have to connect you with Elliot. It sounds like an Elliot specific question, which if you email me, Mary, afterwards, I can connect you with Elliot. It's a great question. We're just out of time. So let's get some concluding statements. Elliot, was that your concluding statement, or did you had something else? So,
I mean, I think that's basically it. I could talk,
I thought it was fantastic. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm saying it's. I feel like I definitely want to carry on with my other two co-panelists and talk more about this. You know, even the night photography, the last time I attempted it, it was on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and I didn't get the chance to try to figure it out because my wife told me we were expecting our first child, and so that distracted me.
Yeah.
It's a very nice way to find out. But I definitely look forward to connecting afterwards. And Leah too, I do see a lot of, even though we're looking at it from different perspectives, a lot of the issues are very similar.
You guys all belong to the same shul, so hopefully you'll catch each other at Kiddush one week. God willing, should be safe, and one day safe enough with masks off, or whatever your preference is. So Leah, why don't you go next, and then Stephen.
Sure. So kind of continuing from the end of the discussion, so Rabbi Kurtz, you said something about getting this panel here to get the facts and the objective truths on these things. So I will say that even the science is still subjective. We always have to make assumptions, and getting into some of these analyses that was, I think, the comment in the chat of thinking about the life cycle of a process from cradle to grave, the very beginning until the end of life of a process. We have to make assumptions, and then when thinking about these technologies, we have to, and whatever people are saying in the news, or it's the next best thing, it's the magic pill that's gonna solve all our problems. We have to assess what the assumptions are, and kind of try to understand some of that for ourselves, what these assumptions are that are going into it, and what the full life cycle impacts might be. So a lot of great solutions out there, but the scientists don't have the objective truth. Hopefully we have some informed opinions at least.
You know, I got to tell you, I'm so glad you ended on that note, because you almost stole my thunder. One of the things that I have, that my hobby and my day job really revolve around is isolating signal from noise. And I said that at the beginning of the conversation. And the problem I'm having in today's environment, it isn't that I think that being ecologically smart is a bad thing. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think having buildings that are ecologically sound make all kinds of sense for a whole slew of reasons. On the other hand, being legislated and being told that you're being evil, or that there's political repercussions, or even worse than that, other repercussions on science, which is honestly, as Leah just pointed out, it is not completely baked. I went to medical school back in the 80s, actually. And one of the things they told me in medical school was 50% of the things we're going to teach you are going to be wrong. The problem is we don't know which 50%. And it turns out that in my career, that little adage actually was spot on. So many things have happened that have been dogma in the beginning. It was dogma to me when I was in medical school to say, if you had pain and you took opioid narcotics, you couldn't get addicted. They taught that to us in medical school. Clearly that's wrong. And we didn't know that it was wrong. The problem I'm having now is that with all of the fervor around, all this, global warming, the world's going to end. They've been talking about global warming since I've been a kid. And I remember Hurricane Camille in 1965. I was very little. And Hurricane Camille came and devastated the Gulf Coast. It was a pretty bad storm. I didn't hear people saying it was due to climate change. And every time you turn on the news these days, they say every single thing is due to climate change. And by the way, I do believe that overuse of carbon fuels can potentially create carbon change, but the signal in the noise here isn't clear. And the signal in the noise here isn't clear because we're looking at things through the tiniest slice of time. Over the course of the time it took for the light to get from Andromeda behind me to my camera's sensor took over 2.3 million years. The problem with climate change is that climate changes over much longer periods of time than the 30 or 40 or 50 years that we've been observing it this way. And even if you go back to 150 years, climates don't change that fast. And in the event like something like a volcano blowing its top in Sumatra or in Iceland could change the equation dramatically. And those are variables that we can't control or understand. So all I'm saying is that you can't just take everything as dogma. You've got to take it with a grain of salt and try to balance it and understand, what are you seeing over the long haul? And human beings are really, really bad at looking at data over the long haul. They look at things and try, our brains are wired from a medical perspective to find patterns in things. It's a thing that we do in order to find and help us survive. We want to find risks in our world. Our brains look for risks, and it helps us to avoid being eaten by a bear because we see the signals that will allow us to escape the bear. But when it comes to looking at things that take time to evolve, like how a flower opens, unless you're studying it over time in a time-lapse photograph, it's incredibly unlikely that you're going to have a basic understanding of how that flower opens or how the climate's going to change if you don't have sufficient amounts of data. And the data is changing so badly and so complicatedly that even the biggest supercomputers can't predict more than 10 days ahead for a weather forecast. So I'm not arguing that it's not happening, but I am questioning that it's happening with such political fervor. That I do question.
So I appreciate.
I would love to.
Yes,
I
wanted you actually to
climate
respond
change
to that.
evidence, but I know we're out of time.
Well, actually, you know what? I mean, I'm not going to be. I think I speak on your behalf. I won't be offended if people need to log off because we're over time. But I think we got to a very critical discussion at the end. I know, Stephen. Thank you for not pulling any punches and for saying what you understand to be the case. I know you kind of transitioned from a statement that Leah made, so I just want to make sure that Leah, do you agree with how Stephen presented the situation, or do you differ somewhat in that final statement?
Yeah, I think I would do a yes and for that one. So I think yes, some of these things are over. Every single time there's a fire, every single time there's a hurricane. It's not like we didn't have hurricanes before. At the same time, there are some pretty clear data on what these higher levels of CO2 are doing to the climate. I'll give some just a concrete example. Nothing to do with temperature. We know that when the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up, that more of that CO2 goes into the ocean. And we see that when CO2 goes in the ocean, based on basic chemistry, the ocean becomes acidic. So it's well documented at an observatory down in Hawaii that the acidity of the ocean is going up. If we keep going on this trend, in about 100 years, a seashell in the ocean will dissolve in a month. And that has some pretty cataclysmic implications for all the fish that eat the seashells and the people that eat the fish. So some of it even beyond these more extreme events, when we can see those direct changes of CO2 increasing. Some of the warming, a lot of the warming initially has been absorbed by the world's oceans. And about 2 or 3 years ago, about 70% of the Great Barrier Reef bleached, which is a distress response, and died. There are a lot of efforts to bring it back, but we're seeing massive eradication of coral reefs just from 1 or 2 degrees of warming in the ocean. So we have to be careful what we're linking climate change to, but these changes that are unprecedented, there are Indian folk songs that talk about the time of year when the monsoon comes that have been around for centuries. And now the monsoons are not coming at those times. And this is something that the time is so ingrained in the culture. And now we're seeing these flooding events and droughts that we never saw before. So there is evidence, but yes, you have to still take all the assumptions with a grain of salt.
Very good. It sounds like you're everyone here is pretty much, I would say, unless Elliot you disagree, in agreement that there is data, there is evidence about climate change. It needs to be taken seriously. At the same time, Stephen, we take your word of caution about not becoming overly zealous to the point that we're not looking at the data with a level head. So I want to thank each of you, Leah, Stephen, Elliot, for joining us this evening, as well as all of the people from Agudah Shalom and beyond who joined us for this Tu B'Shvat conversation. And this is just a great example of a few very talented people that exist within our community. And it's just it's a real privilege that you guys decided to share your time with us this evening and to share your expertise and share your insights and knowledge. I hope we don't get to a point where, Stephen, you need to terraform Mars for us because the world goes awry. But hopefully we don't have to reach that point anytime soon, hopefully through the work that Leigh and Elliot that you guys are doing. So Yasher Koach, looking forward to continuing the conversation. Hopefully I'll catch you guys all at shul sometime soon. And we could keep this conversation going about how we could be a more conscientious and careful community for our immediate surroundings, but as well as the entire world. Yasher Koach, and wishing everybody a happy Tu B'Shvat. Chakras tomorrow, 6:30, 8:30, and no Tachanan.
Thank you very much, Rabbi
All right.
Kurtz and everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Take care, everyone.
Good